The lecture hall of Galaxis Interstellar Academy shimmered under layered glass domes, catching sunlight from 2 distant stars. Hundreds of students filled the tiered seats, their voices a low murmur of 100 species learning to coexist. Across every row, glowing tablets hovered mid-air, tuned to the day's most anticipated lecture. Cross-Species Reproductive Biology Advanced Series. At the top row, still and silent, sat Alira of Azura. Her skin shimmered like pale opal, and her white robes, precisely folded, bore the crest of her planet's elite scientific order. She sat upright, eyes sharp, chin high, emotionless, perfectly Azuran. Until the screen at the front pulsed to life, and Professor Rix appeared, his voice smooth, elegant, and far too casual for the chaos he was about to unleash. "Today," he began, "we explore one of the more unusual deviations in reproductive patterns across sapient species. Let us consider humans." A chart blinked open. "A male human," the professor continued, "is fertile throughout every cycle, not seasonally, not in response to lunar signals, not according to hormonal surges, constantly, unrestricted, active." The hall fell silent. Alira blinked once, then again. She thought she had misheard. Professor Rix went on, unfazed. "Whereas many species, your own included, require seasonal or chemical stimuli to enter reproductive readiness, human males appear biologically prepared for mating at any moment. No downtime, no regulation." Gasps, murmurs, a few chuckles from species who found the idea absurd. But it was the sound directly in front of Alira that made her freeze. A low, lazy chuckle. She glanced down. Logan, a human male, broad shoulders, messy hair, a uniform code bent at the collar. He was lounging in his seat, arm draped over the backrest, expression unreadable. But she saw it. That slight smirk, that sideways glance, angled just enough to catch her reaction. He had been watching her. She turned her gaze forward again, jaw tight. "That cannot be correct," she said aloud, her voice calm but slicing through the room. Professor Rix paused. "Miss Alira?" She rose slowly. "Such a biological design would be wasteful, illogical, evolutionarily inefficient." There were nods from other Azurans, whispers from the biological elite. "But correct," Rix replied. "According to centuries of verified human data, their reproductive system operates continuously. Males produce gametes without cycle, without pause, without specific external triggers." More chuckles, a soft, scandalized laugh from the back. Alira clenched her tablet. Logan raised his hand, still smiling. "Permission to speak?" he said. The professor nodded. Logan turned halfway in his seat, catching Alira's eyes directly. "I know it sounds a little wild to some of you," he said, voice smooth, laced with mischief. "But we humans are just built that way, ready for anything, any time." Alira's skin heated, just slightly. Unacceptable. "You mean undisciplined?" she said sharply. He smiled wider. "I prefer adaptable." Around them, the room buzzed. But for Alira, everything else disappeared. In all her studies, all her logical constructs, all her carefully controlled variables, she had never accounted for this. A species with no rules to follow. And a man who looked at her like he knew she had just added him to her mental list of anomalies. Logan turned back in his seat, satisfied, and Alira sat down slowly, fingers tapping her notes, gaze forward. But her mind was no longer in control. The central library of Galaxis Interstellar Academy stretched like a cathedral of knowledge. Floors upon floors of silent aisles, each one lined with shimmering data cores and ancient physical volumes suspended in magnetic stasis. Light filtered through transparent panels high above, dappled with starlight from the twin moons of the Academy's orbital path. Here, minds were sharpened, theories were born, and distractions had no place. At least, they shouldn't have. Alira sat at a private research table, surrounded by a series of holographic projections, complex matrices, hormone charts, comparative analysis of interspecies reproductive cycles. Her long fingers moved with mechanical precision, filtering through columns of data, her lips pressed into a neutral line, but her eyes kept betraying her, because every few minutes they drifted across the hall, to a corner table where Logan sat, legs kicked up, leaning back in his chair, a datapad propped lazily in one hand while he munched on something utterly non-academic. She told herself it was coincidence. The library was public, open. He had every right to sit wherever he wanted, even if he had chosen that exact table 3 days in a row, even if he always looked bored until he noticed her looking, and then, like clockwork, he would smile. Not the full kind, just the corner of his mouth curving upward, like he knew something she didn't. Today, he didn't just smile. He stood, walked across the floor, and sat down directly across from her without asking. Alira's posture stiffened. This section is for advanced xenobiological research. Logan shrugged. I'm researching something very advanced. She didn't look up. What, may I ask? He leaned in, elbows on the table, eyes gleaming with humor. You. Alira blinked once, then slowly raised her gaze to meet his. Explain. He grinned. I've never seen someone so utterly offended by the concept of human biology before. It's kind of amazing. Her tone was flat. I was not offended. I was alarmed. There's a difference. Sure, Logan said. But the way your datapad cracked at the edge, that was offense. Alira narrowed her eyes. Your species is genetically uneconomical. No control, no rhythm, a biological hazard. He smiled wider. So you've been thinking about it. She froze. He leaned closer, voice dropping. About us. About what we are, how we work. I think about all anomalous data sets, she said crisply, but her voice was too sharp, her breath too quick. He watched her for a moment. Then, more gently, I'm not here to antagonize you, Alira. I'm just curious. Why does it bother you so much that we're different? She hesitated, then, because it doesn't fit. The structure, the logic, you defy pattern. Logan tilted his head. Maybe not all knowledge fits into charts and formulas. All things can be studied. But not all things can be explained. She fell silent, uncertain how to counter that. He stood again, sliding a folded note card across the table. Old-fashioned, made of actual paper. On it, a hand-drawn diagram of a heart, not anatomical, stylized, human. She stared at it. He said nothing, just smiled again, softer this time, and walked away. Alira watched him leave, that strange symbol sitting between her and her datapads like a virus her code couldn't purge. She picked up the card and tucked it into her notebook. Just for analysis, of course. The observatory dome of Galaxis Interstellar Academy opened like the petals of a sleeping flower, unveiling the velvet sprawl of deep space above. Thousands of stars shimmered across the curved glass, and in the far distance, the spiral arms of a nearby galaxy glowed like a promise whispered from eternity. It was quiet here, sacred, a place where logic bowed to the infinite. Alira stood at the edge of the railing, arms folded behind her back, her breath even but her mind restless. She had come here to think, to distance herself from the noise of the day, the tug-of-war inside her mind that no amount of formulas could silence. But the noise found her. I was starting to think you were avoiding me. She didn't have to turn. Logan stepped out from the shadows behind her, his voice low, casual, but softer than usual, as if he knew the stars demanded respect. Ailira's eyes remained on the constellations. It is statistically probable that in an institution housing over 10,000 students, our paths would not cross repeatedly without intent. He chuckled. So you were avoiding me. Silence. Then she exhaled slowly. Yes. Logan came to stand beside her, careful not to crowd her space. His gaze lifted to the sky. Do you ever wonder, he said, if the stars get tired of being looked at and never seen? She turned to him. Explain. I mean, he continued, billions of eyes stare up at them every night. Chart them, measure them, worship them. But no one ever asks what they want. What if they don't want to be data points? What if they just want quiet? Ailira blinked, caught off guard. Stars are celestial plasma. They do not want anything. He smiled. Neither do I sometimes. Doesn't mean I don't feel it. A moment passed. Then she asked, quieter, why do you talk to me like this? Logan didn't answer right away. Then, with a small shrug, because when I look at you, I don't just see Azura's top student. I see someone trying so hard to understand everything that she's afraid of what she can't. Her shoulders tensed. I am not afraid. He turned to her, eyes searching hers. Then why do you always pull away when I get close? The stars spun silently above. Ailira looked away. Because I don't understand what this is. This? Logan asked. She nodded. You. The way you look at me. The way my chest tightens when you do. There is no chart for it, no cycle, no biological reason. He stepped closer, not forceful, just near. You don't need a reason to feel, he said. Sometimes it just is. Ailira's breath caught as his fingers brushed hers, barely a touch, like a question waiting to be answered. Her hand didn't move. He looked at her again, softer now. I'm not here to confuse you, Ailira. I'm just here. That's it. They stood like that beneath the endless stars. No more arguments, no clever phrases, just one touch, one truth. And in that silence, for the first time in her life, she let herself feel something without needing to understand it. It felt like falling, and it didn't scare her. It made her wonder what else she had been missing. The corridor lights dimmed at precisely 2200 hours, signaling curfew across the Galaxis Interstellar Academy. Most students had already retreated to their quarters or study pods, leaving the halls quiet, too quiet. The sterile glow of the walls hummed faintly, casting long shadows between the pillars. Ailira moved with measured pace. Datapad clutched tightly to her chest. Her mind was a storm of conflicting equations. Since that night under the stars, she had not been able to think in straight lines. Her thoughts, usually clean, clinical, logical, kept veering. Toward his voice, his words, his touch. She needed silence, distance, control. Instead, she got him. Out late, Professor? Logan's voice echoed from behind her, a teasing warmth woven through the cool air. She froze, turned. He was leaning against the wall just ahead, arms crossed, still in uniform but slightly disheveled in a way that made him look dangerous and at ease all at once. Do you always wait in dark corridors to ambush innocent scholars? She asked, tone flat, but masking something unsteady beneath. He stepped into the light. Only the ones who pretend they're not human beneath the logic. I am not human, she snapped. He smiled, slow and calm. Could have fooled me. Ailira stepped closer, shoulders tense. You're arrogant, unstructured. You flirt with everyone and disrespect boundaries. And yet, he said, stepping forward too, you're still standing here. Their eyes locked. The air shifted. You think this is funny, she said, that I'm some exotic challenge to conquer. "No," he said, a voice low now. "I think you're the most interesting person I've ever met. I think you terrify me in the best possible way, and I think you're lying to yourself because if you weren't, you'd have walked away already." Elira's breath caught. She should have walked, should have turned and left, but instead, she kissed him, quick, fierce, a burst of fire wrapped in starlight. Her fingers grabbed the collar of his jacket, pulling him down, just enough for their mouths to meet. And for a second, time fractured. Logan didn't move, didn't push. He only returned the kiss with a softness she hadn't expected. No hunger, no pressure, just presence. She pulled away, breath shaky. He stayed still, eyes searching hers. "Elira, don't say anything," she whispered. But he smiled. "Then let me show you something." He reached up, gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I'm not here to break your rules. I'm just asking to be in the same equation." Her pulse raced. She turned and walked away fast, heart pounding in her throat. But she didn't delete the moment, didn't regret the kiss. And in the quiet of her quarters that night when she replayed it in her mind, she touched her lips, and for once let herself smile. The days after the kiss moved like static. For everyone else, the academy flowed on. Lectures, training drills, research modules. But for Elira, time fractured into sharp moments she could not categorize. She avoided him, changed corridors, skipped common dining hours, deleted unread messages. Her logic told her this was the correct response. Temporary lapse, emotional misfire, move on. But her body, her heart, disagreed. Because every time her eyes flickered across a crowd, they looked for him. And every time a shadow crossed her study pod, she held her breath, hoping it might be his. But she didn't let herself respond, because if she did, the equation would break completely. Logan, however, was not done. He didn't push, he didn't chase, not like the stories Elira had read about aggressive human courtship. Instead, he waited, with quiet, unnerving precision. He left no flowers. He left facts. A note slid under her door. "Your thesis on reproductive autonomy skips over neural vulnerability. I disagree," with citations. 3 sources attached. Another message inside a borrowed book. "You miscalculated the hormonal variance in cross-species empathy. See annotated page 42. Each one was like a challenge, a tether, a memory of a conversation she wasn't ready to end. Still, she said nothing, until the day she walked through the lecture courtyard and saw him, cornered by 3 senior students. 2 from her planet, Azuran. They spoke in their usual cold tone, measured words wrapped in disdain. "I'm surprised you're still here, human. Some of us assumed Elira had made herself clear." "She did," Logan replied, folding his arms. "She said nothing, but that says more than you think." One Azuran tilted his head. "You misunderstand silence." "No," Logan said. "I understand fear. I recognize it. I've lived in it. She's not cold. She's overwhelmed." "Perhaps you mistake curiosity for connection." "Maybe," Logan said, voice quieter now. "But maybe I'm the only one who actually saw her." The Azuran stepped closer, and then Elira appeared. She didn't run. She walked, straight-backed, eyes hard, cutting through the circle of students like a blade through mist. "I do not need interpretation," she said, voice sharp and crystalline. "Not from him, not from you." The Azurans stiffened. She turned to Logan, gaze unreadable. "You're insufferable." He smiled. "And yet here you are." Silence. Then, slowly, she stepped closer. Her voice softened. "I don't know how to do this." Logan didn't move. "Neither do I." "But I can't ignore it anymore," she whispered. He nodded. "Then don't." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a data pad. It was the same one he had annotated. On the screen, a new section, written in her own hand. At the top, the variable I cannot eliminate. Logan. She handed it to him and walked away, this time not to run, but to breathe. The biology lab was supposed to be empty after 2200, a place of sterile surfaces, humming machines, and quiet code, nothing more. But tonight, the lights were low. The holographic diagrams flickered in standby mode, and two people stood on opposite sides of the room, the distance between them tighter than the silence they were holding. Elira faced away, her back rigid, hands trembling where they rested on the edge of the console. She had called him here. No explanation, no message, just a room number. Logan stood behind her, waiting. "I've studied everything about your kind," she said quietly, a voice thin but controlled. "Metabolism, memory retention, pheromone cycles, hormonal response, even your scent profile." He smiled faintly, but said nothing. "But none of it accounts for this," she whispered. "For the way I feel when you're near, for the way I think about your voice when I should be studying, for the way my body responds before my mind can explain it." She turned slowly, finally facing him. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with clarity. "I thought I needed logic to survive you, but maybe I just needed permission." Logan took one step closer, then another. "You don't need my permission." She met his gaze. "Number I need my own." And with that, she closed the distance. Their mouths met in a slow, uncertain kiss. Not the fire of the hallway, not the stolen moment under stars. This was different. This was discovery. A slow descent into something neither of them had mapped, filled with touches meant to ask, "Are you sure?" and responses that whispered yes in return. Logan's hands moved with reverence, never rushing, never claiming. He kissed her as if she were fragile and powerful all at once. Elira's fingers slipped into his hair, anchoring herself to something real, grounding her body in sensations no theory had ever prepared her for. When they fell together onto the medical cot at the side of the lab, it wasn't frantic. It was deliberate. Every breath shared, every inch of skin exposed, every trembling sigh, an experiment in belonging. She guided his hands across her curves like pages of a language he was learning to read. And he did, carefully, devotedly. He memorized the sound of her breath, the hitch in her throat when he kissed the hollow of her neck, the quiet gasp when she let go of control and let him in. And she learned, too. That trust could be tender. That surrender didn't mean weakness. That love, this thing she never understood, was not just emotion. It was presence. It was him. Later, as they lay in the dim light, skin against skin, hearts still racing, Elira whispered, "I don't know what happens tomorrow." Logan pulled her closer, brushing his lips across her temple. "We find out together." And in that silence, wrapped in warmth and starlight, Elira realized she hadn't lost herself. She had found something she didn't know she was missing. The morning light inside the academy's upper atrium was harsh. Not the soft golden hue of sunrise, but a sterile, administrative glow. The kind that came with consequences. Elira stood in the middle of the Azuran council room. A tall circular chamber lined with crystalline pillars and silver-robed elders. She wore her formal robes again. High collar, polished badge of academic rank. But she no longer felt like the girl who had first arrived at the academy, believing knowledge would protect her from emotion. Not after last night. Not after Logan. The head elder's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "You broke Code 10. Article 4. No physical intimacy with subjects of unsanctioned interspecies study, especially not humans. Elira kept her chin high. He is not a subject. He is a person. I did not use him for research. I chose him. Gasps. One elder leaned forward, voice tight. You compromised decades of Azuran diplomatic neutrality. There will be repercussions. Another added coldly, You were one of our brightest. Now you are a liability. Elira said nothing, because every time she thought of Logan's hands, his voice whispering, We find out together, the fear shrank. Across campus, in a different part of the building, Logan was facing his own tribunal. Not in a grand hall, but in a plain, fluorescent-lit office with 3 human administrators and a mountain of forms. No interspecies intimacy without council notification. No physical bonding without psychological clearance. This academy is not a romance simulator, Mr. Vale. He crossed his arms, jaw tight. So, I'm supposed to get permission before I feel something real? The lead official raised a brow. You're supposed to follow protocol. She's not protocol, Logan said. She's a Lyra. The room fell silent. Back in the council hall, Elira's voice rang clear. I accept responsibility, but I will not apologize for being awake. A pause. One of the elders sighed, then delivered the verdict. Your studies are suspended. You are to return to Azura for review, immediately. Elira turned her face toward the tall window behind the elders, the stars calling beyond the glass. Then I will go. She left the room without ceremony, her steps calm but weighted. And outside, beneath the open sky where students milled unaware, Logan stood waiting. Their eyes met. Neither smiled, but both understood. He stepped toward her. They're sending you back. She nodded. And they're silencing you. He placed a hand on his chest. They can silence my voice. Not this. He stepped closer, placed that same hand gently over her sternum, right where her heart beat. You don't owe me anything, he said. But I meant every word. I'm not walking away. Elira closed her eyes. You have no idea what you're promising. I don't care, he whispered. Some things are worth the risk. She wanted to kiss him, to say she'd stay, but she knew the systems, knew how long it would take to tear them down. So she stepped back and whispered, Then wait for me. And he nodded once. Always. The lecture hall was nearly empty. Late afternoon light spilled through the skylight, casting soft beams across the polished floor. Dust drifted in the air like suspended memory. At the far end, a single figure sat in the second row, leaning back, legs stretched out, arms crossed over his chest. Logan? It had been 63 days since she left. 63 days of blank datapads, of unread messages, of walking past her old study seat and pretending it meant nothing. He kept showing up to lectures, kept watching the door, just in case. Today felt no different, until it was. A soft sound of footsteps, not fast, not cautious, just present. He looked up, and there she was, Elira. No robes, no council insignia, just a simple Earth-style tunic, hair loose, eyes steady. Loain goi that kien han, she said softly. He blinked, then slowly stood. You're back. I asked for an indefinite leave from the Azuran program, she said. Told them I needed to explore something that defied their metrics. He stepped closer, afraid to breathe. They asked what kind of research, she continued. I told them it was classified. A ghost of a smile curved his lips. So, you're here to study me again? No, she said. I'm here to learn. If you're still willing to teach. Logan didn't answer right away. He just stepped forward until they were close enough for their shadows to merge. I thought you were gone for good, he whispered. I was, she replied. Until I realized I didn't want a world where you weren't in the equation. He touched her face gently, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then class is in session, she smiled. And for the first time in her life, it wasn't controlled. It wasn't polite, it was real. They sat side by side, in the same row where they first argued, her hand slowly finding his under the desk, fingers lacing through his. No words were needed, because this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the start of something no data point could contain. Something human, something true. If you had the chance to rewrite your entire belief system for someone who saw you completely, would you take it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the greatest lesson is not found in books, but in the person you never saw coming.